Hello, my name is Brennan, and welcome to this episode of Pancake Psychology. So today we're going to be looking at the topic of resilience, and this has easily been one of the favorite topics that I've had so far during my studies. I've been studying it in my class, Psychological Resilience. I'm going to be taking another one called Psychology of Trauma next semester that'll really tie well with it. But what is resilience? Starting to get on track here. So resilience as a concept has a wide array of definitions, and they can all be applied and considered as an interpretation of resilience as a whole. The general definition that I agree with the most is resilience is the ability to bounce back or overcome some form of adversity, and the APA's definition is very similar as well, saying that resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. It's a mouthful, so generally speaking, resilience is a combination of adversity, a risk, and positive outcomes. So starting with this definition and working through the other two is going to help us kind of form a general idea of what forms resilience. So adversity and risk are the first part of our definition. Adversity is loosely defined as being suffering that's associated with difficulty. This typically takes the form of some kind of a negative life event or a circumstance that we associate with adjustment issues. Risks or risk factors are a clearly defined behavior or constitutional, like genetic, psychological, environmental, just other characteristic that's associated with an increased possibility or likelihood that a disease or disorder will subsequently develop in an individual. So the chance that abnormal psychology is going to develop in this individual. So there's a bit to unpack there as well. But the most important thing to remember is that genetic, psychological, and environmental characteristics, among other things, can affect the likelihood that you develop a disorder or have some other kind of negative outcome. And there's a lot of ways we can track that, but that's another topic. So you can have so many examples for these kinds of characteristics, but a couple examples just of genetic characteristics that I thought could be good. One that I thought was between certain disorders and genetics, there's been a proven correlation. I thought of bipolar disorder. There's been certain studies that have shown families where a relative has bipolar disorder, bipolar proband offspring, which are children from that relative with bipolar disorder, are anywhere from 5 to 70 times likelier to develop bipolar disorder sometime in their life. And another example of a genetic factor is alcohol use disorder. Genetics constitutes around half of the risk for this disorder, with environmental factors generally making up the rest of the risk. You can get into a lot of these factors, but that was just a quick example I had decided to put in my little script I've got up here. The final portion of our resilience definition, though, is positive outcomes. Positive outcomes are defined as an outcome where an individual maintains, regains probably, or surpasses their level of functioning prior to the exposure to the risk or adversity. So we've got our risk definition, we have our positive outcomes now, and the ways that we track that are generally through a lack of psychopathology, which is mental illness or other deviant functioning mentally, and signs of competent, which is, are you functioning at an appropriate level across several domains? And this can be social, this can be your relationships with your family. Generally, these outcomes are influenced in two ways, and they're called promotive and protective factors. Think of these together as factors that help to curb the chance of an adverse outcome. This can come in many forms, with anything from a community center acting as a place where people can go if they need in a time of crisis, to a dedicated mentor that can serve to help the person, maybe focus on career goals, to keep them on track, to kind of promote them to grow in positive ways. So back to the most basic functional definition. Resilience is a combination of adversity or risk and positive outcomes. So redefined, it is when an individual faces suffering that they associate with difficulty, or some characteristic that increases the likelihood of some negative outcome, and they're able to maintain competent functioning and a lack of psychopathology afterwards. So how does that compare to the original definition, the APA's big expanded definition? It meets all of these criteria: the ability to bounce back or overcome, being competent in your level of functioning, and having a lack of psychopathology and adversity, which we already defined. So resilience is a very, very broad subject. There's a lot that I could talk about with it, but one thing that I feel like is a good kind of introduction just into how the idea is applied is something called the challenge model. So the challenge model is the idea that there's this happy medium between having too much stress, too much adversity in someone's life, and too little adversity. And it's this healthy space where you're able to learn to build resilience and these positive coping mechanisms without being overwhelmed by stress and having these negative outcomes that we associate with it sometimes negatively affect you, for lack of better words. I think that a hypothetical example is the best way that I can demonstrate it. So earlier, the protective and promotive factors. Imagine that there is a boy who lives his entire life interacting only with his family, basically. Like, the only interactions he has is with his mother and this very close-knit group of people. Every day as he wakes up, his mom cooks him breakfast. He's homeschooled in his dining room by a private tutor. His dad comes home and they play football together. He kind of lives this cookie-cutter perfect life. Well, he turns 12 and his parents decide that it's best for him to go out and try a public school. He's never had any practice in these social settings, and he isn't very adept at interacting with his peers. So they call him names, they bully him, it's upsetting him. He doesn't have any experience dealing with adversity or stress like this. He's got no coping mechanisms that he's developed that he can turn to in these situations. This is what the primary focus of the challenge model is all about: finding a healthy medium of stress. Too little stress, like with this boy, and it's made it so that he has not had the practice he needs to develop these essential skills for real, meaningful interactions. Now, think about the inverse kind of. Think about a little girl who lives with her mother and two sisters. Her father exited their family whenever she was 3 because he was taken to prison after physically abusing his wife. At the age of 10, this girl is cleaning the house every day, cooking, since her mom is working 3 jobs and not around much. And one day, this girl and her mother are driving to see a movie. They get in a car crash. The mom's ejected from the vehicle, pronounced dead at the scene. Girl falls unconscious less than a minute after the accident, sees her mother lying motionless on the ground. There's no break in stress for this girl. It's just this overwhelming adversity for her entire life. There's no time that she's had to really sit down and be able to process and learn these positive coping skills. The only mechanisms that she's been able to pick up are those that she needs to survive, and that could be anything from a brutal cycle of disassociation and self-harm to possible other suicidal tendencies. Just anything that she can do to reduce stress for her. This is the opposite of the challenge model. Too much stress, no time for positive development. We, as human beings, often employ what we might consider generally unhealthy habits after some kind of a trauma. Say a family member dies. We might deny the event. We could disassociate by drowning out our thoughts with music, anything. This is a normal reaction. There's nothing to be worried about. This is a survival instinct. It gives us time to be able to manage the stress and consequences of large events, not right as they happen, but at some later date. You're going to process them eventually. There was an analogy that my GA friend had taught us in class one day about the challenge model, and she called it the toolbox metaphor. So imagine you're going through a trauma and you learn a strategy for coping with it. Think of it like adding a tool to a toolbox. Say you've learned you have a friend you can rely on or something. I don't know. The goal of resilience is to allow people to understand how they can effectively use these tools. How do we train them to learn which tools to use and when? How do we prepare them for what is going to come unexpectedly, and being able to have that knowledge and the instinct, really, to use these specific strategies appropriately? Think of small traumas like adding one tool to your toolbox. Large traumas, you've thrown a bunch of tool in the toolbox, you don't know what works, you can't tell the difference between a wrench and a blowtorch. You don't have the time to process every option and mentally evaluate which one works the best for you. You're simply surviving. This is the side of the challenge model that our girl from the fictional example was facing. She was thrown just absolutely every tool, and it was very hard to figure out on her own. And this is one of the, trying not to get into other topics because it's already gone a little long, this is one of the leading factors for negative outcomes. In another video, I'm probably going to talk about trauma and how complex trauma can negatively affect people in different ways, because a large portion of resilience studies, especially some of the first studies that were conducted, looked at just how negative some of the effects of complex traumas. So instead of just like one singular event, like just the car crash for the girl, if it had been a car crash and then she had been kidnapped, and I don't know, just this never-ending stream of bad things, how that negatively affects people so much worse than just one negative event. So I'm going to end the video here for now. It's already at 12 minutes long or so. There's a bunch of possible topics if anyone might be interested in more resilience related videos. I know I'm going to do one on the explanatory style, so think of that just like a way, our cognitive process of how we break down a traumatic event after it happens. I might talk about abstraction. I'm writing about that in my honors thesis right now. PTSD and CPTSD, so complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Cognitive distortions. There's so much content that each point could have a video on its own, and I might do just little short 2-minute videos on them. I just wanted to start with this challenge model and the definitions of resilience, because I really feel like having a functional definition makes applying the content of that specific field of study so much easier. The challenge model is just a good practical example of how these concepts can be applied. You're looking at adversity, you're looking at positive outcomes, so are two core components of resilience. Remember, what is resilience? It's the ability to bounce back, return to some functional state, appropriately functional state, after adversity. So that's all from me for now. Till next time, I'm Brennan. Thank you for watching my video.